A river comes out of Eden to irrigate the garden. Now, I'm going to point out how this little excerpt is related to neuroanatomy and neuroscience, so the anatomy of the brain and nervous system, and as well the cerebrospinal fluid that goes up and down the spine and into the brain, and it has certain hormones in it, and it controls like pressure in the brain and the cranium, and flows through different ventricles of the brain. So keep that in mind when you listen to this source, and see if you can make some connections. It's kind of remarkable what they knew about, the anatomy of the human body, and especially the brain, going back, even thousands of years, hundreds of years for sure. So a river comes out of Eden to irrigate the garden. Be as meticulous concerning the performance of the commandments deemed as inconsequential as you are with the performance of the commandments deemed of great significance, since you do not know the amount of reward in store for any of the commandments. Our sages explained that the author of this saying referred to the amount of satisfaction that the performance of each commandment gives to the Creator. We mortals have no way of gauging what ranks high in the esteem of the lawgiver. The only thing that we know definitely about this is that as a result of the satisfaction that God derived from our mitzvah performance, He will give us opportunities to perform more commandments. When a father hears words of wisdom from his son, he encourages him to come up with more wise comments. Similarly, when God derived pleasure and satisfaction from the deeds of one of His children, He encourages that child to continue to come up with more intelligent questions and answers. And now they're going to discuss the concept of Eden and garden. Eden, this describes the pleasure derived by God from His children's words of Torah and performance of His commandments. So Eden is describing this pleasure, God's pleasure. Whereas the word for garden is a reference to the various levels at which Torah can be studied. So just as a garden contains many flowers, each of which having a distinct appearance and pleasing aroma, there are different levels of Torah study. The words of Torah His children speak, by means of which they provide spiritual irrigation in all four directions of the earth, are alluded to by the river splitting into four heads from our verse. Very interesting. So here's what it all means. Performance of the commandments is perceived as irrigating the brain or the cranium that consists of four cavities, one of them being a cavity divided into two parts. This stream channels this inspiration directly from God and branches out into four quote-unquote rivers, each channeling inspiration to the four lobes of the brain that fill these cavities or ventricles. Each branch feeds the appropriate lobe according to its function. The word for Eden describes the region from which pleasurable experiences emanate. The word for garden in this allegory includes the various disciplines comprising Torah study, commonly known as Pashat, or the plain meaning of the text, the Drash, the allegorical meaning, or the homily, the Remetz is the allusion or hint, and the Sod is the mystical aspects or the secrets. Keeping this in mind, we can understand why the Mishnah quoted, or the Mishnah that we quoted, began with a warning: be careful to discern, seeing that the same Mishnah told us that we do not know how the various commandments rate in terms of the reward for those who perform them. And since we do not know How are we to distinguish between what is weighty and what is relatively less weighty in the eyes of God? So we don't know the mind of God. So they're saying to be careful with all of the commandments and do them with zeal, do them carefully. But it's very interesting how Eden is associated with pleasure, and this garden is associated with the various with pardes, the various levels of Torah study.